browser storage is one of the most powerful features within the user source listener. This one is really cool. I love using this because it allows us to capture information about the user's traffic sources and allow that to persist in the browser over time. And once it's in the browser, we can then extract it from browser storage and put it back into the data layer or push it into hidden fields on our forms. And all of this can be done inside of Listen Layer. Now, if you haven't, go back and watch the video. There'll be a learn button right here by the time you see this under the capture user source feature, because we walk through how the user sources actually work. And we actually set up this example that we're going to walk through in browser storage. So this example assumes that you already understand how this user source information is identified and pushed into the data layer and how you might customize it. In this case, you can see we had a user that came in with some URL parameters that identified them as coming from Google Ads. And we actually have a pipe here, and then we're pushing in the timestamp at the end of that. And this is the ISO timestamp format. We know now that this user came from Google Ads, and here is the time that they came from Google Ads. That's being pushed into the data layer. So what we're going to look at now is how we can store that in the browser. Now, let's enable the browser storage feature. And what we'll see is we have a new menu item down here called browser storage, and we can write rules. But before we write rules, similar to a custom data layer value, we need something to push the values into. And browser storage allows us to use cookies, local storage, or session storage. A cookie obviously just has a name. Local storage and session storage have what's called keys. So we need to define those things, think of them as almost like a variable, and then we're going to be pushing a value into those. So let's jump to browser storage variables. And here we have a few of these defined, but let's go ahead and see if we can delete them. If they're not being used, then we should be able to delete them, and let's recreate these. So I'm going to create one here called user source. But in the overall scheme of my tracking, I care about three things. I care about the user's first traffic source. And I'm going to capitalize. No, I'm going to lowercase my f, sorry. And then I care about user source last. So that would be the most recent. And I care about user source path. So this is a chained list of all the user sources that we've seen for a user over time. And I like to use local storage for a number of reasons. I think it persists better. Keep in mind, this is all first-party data. And so none of this is going to be targeted from a third-party cookie standpoint. But you still may need to get consent from users to persist this information. So let's go ahead and save these. And then we're going to jump back to browser storage, and we're going to write a simple rule. It's going to be a local storage rule. And we're going to store user source information. And so every time a user source is identified and that event is pushed into the data layer, we're going to set the value of our cookies. We're going to build a rule for user source first. We're going to build a rule for user source last. And we're going to build a rule for user source path. And the difference between these rules is going to be what we do if there's a value that already exists. So here, if we want to keep the first value that's ever pushed into this local storage key, then we're never going to overwrite it with something new. And if we want to keep the last value, then we're always going to overwrite it. And if we want to, we can also keep a comma delimited chain. Now, keep an eye out for some enhancements here, because eventually we are going to have the ability to make calculations in here. So you could do something like increment a user score locally in their browser, for example, by just summing a new integer into an old integer. So there's going to be some cool enhancements coming, but there already is some really cool functionality built into what we're going to actually set this value to. So over here in this field, we're going to set this value. Now we can type something in here. We could say like the sky is blue, which everybody knows is not always true. So we can put our own string value, or we could insert the value from a custom variable. So if you've followed along to some of the other features, there's a feature inside this user source feature. Watch the video for it. It's called the custom data layer values. And we define user source medium. Because listen layer has a user source, we can then write a rule to infer the medium based on those sources, and we can group them together. So we could push that into the user source value, but in this case, we're just going to get the actual user source. And we could even put a timestamp in here. But remember, we actually already have a timestamp being pushed into the into their user source here. And so we're not going to go ahead, we're not going to do that in this case. So and actually this is the wrong one. That's the user's last source. Sorry about that. We want to get the user's source right here. So we're going to search for dot source. I want to get the correct one, automatic values dot source. That's going to correspond here to automatic values dot source. And we're going to push this into all of them. But remember that in this case, if there's an existing value, it's not going to overwrite. In this case, it is going to overwrite. And in this case, it's going to add it as a comma delimited list. We're going to go ahead and save that. And we're going to publish. Save user source. And we're going to empty a cache and hard reload. And I may have already had some values in my local storage, so let's look here. Okay, so here I've gone into my application tab and I'm looking at local storage, and we can see the 3 keys that we just created, first, path, and last. And they have the information from my user source because I just visited the website with a user source defined. And let's change this. Let's just change this to Google Display. And we should see this update in real time. You can see my path now has 2 values. Google Ads Discovery, Google Ads Display. Now, this looks a little bit convoluted because we have the timestamping here as well. So this is a more advanced example where we can accumulate a user source path over time, along with timestamps from exactly when that information occurred. And then we can use that, we can put it into something like BigQuery, and we can understand, we can actually kind of model out or visualize out like the actual path of the user and what the distance was between those from a time standpoint. And of course, there's different timestamp formats that you can use and you can push in here. Or we can get rid of this and take it out of our user source, and we can just have a chain path of Google Organic, Google Ads. I think we had a Capterra example here, and so we'll see if that rule still exists. Yep, our last is Capterra, and so now we can see we have Capterra at the end. Now, of course, if you were to follow those, those other videos that I told you to watch, you'll see that the user source rules, as an example, we inserted timestamp, but we didn't insert timestamp on all of them. We actually left it off of Capterra and some of these other ones, and that's why the Capterra one just came through without a timestamp on it. So you don't need the timestamp. It can be a little bit complicated. So you might be thinking, well, that's cool. We can store user source information in the browser, but what would be the purpose of that? So let's drive this point home by taking a look at our HubSpot forms. We're going to look at custom values, and we're going to write a quick rule here, a simple rule. And we're going to get the user source out of browser storage. And we're going to do this every time a form is submitted. And so I wrote a condition. Every time a form is submitted, we're going to get the user's traffic source. And I don't know that I have a great variable to push this into. Yep, user source path at conversion. Perfect. So this is a conversion event, right? Somebody's filling out a form. And we're going to get the user source path, and we're going to push that into the data layer at the moment that the form is submitted. So then we'll know, we can capture that in GA4 if we want our own attribution model in there. We could store it. We could send it to Snowflake or BigQuery. We can do so much with this information. Now, another thing that I'm not going to get into is a lot of the form features have this, or form listers have this feature called Populate Fields. You can actually write rules inside of listener that will populate fields, hidden fields, most likely, in your forms with information from the browser. So you could have a hidden field on your HubSpot forms, and you could capture the entire user source path on that hidden field, and you could keep that with the lead record, so you know exactly where that person is coming from or where they came from. But in this case, we're just going to push it back into the data layer, which is cool enough. That's something that's really cool. You could then capture that information into a Google Sheet as a very kind of rudimentary example of, hey, every time an event occurs, I want to know exactly what the user's path was. I'm going to store that. If you're going to store the person's information from the form submission, make sure that you have permission to do that. And also make sure that you're not saving any of their personal information inside of Listen Layer, because that's against our terms of service. That data belongs to you. And so you can take it and do what you are legally allowed to do with that in your jurisdiction. So here, let's go ahead and publish this. I'm going to add user source to HubSpot forms. And here we're definitely going to do a hard refresh. And we're going to jump to our HubSpot forms. And notice, so we have a user source path here. It's this really long string here that, again, the timestamps can be a little confusing. And we're going to go ahead and fill out a form. And assuming I wrote that rule correctly, which I wrote really quickly, we should have some cool data layer information. So we have a HubSpot form that was just submitted. We're going to go down here to user source and check this out. Now in our data layer, directly in our data layer, it looks kind of funny because Google does these line breaks and adds some crazy stuff in them. Go wide enough, it'll merge it back together. But the entire path of that user has been pushed into the data layer. It might actually be easier to see in the console because it's not going to be broken into two pieces. I'm going to find data layer activity here. Must be this one. Nope. Here it is. Form submitted. Form custom values. And here's our user source path. So we could target this. You could copy the property path and we could register this in Google Tag Manager. We could grab onto it. And every time this HS form submit occurs, we will get the entire path of the user's historical traffic activity on our website. Again, that's all first party data. You are storing something in the browser. So you may need to obtain consent from the user before actually doing that. And Listen Layer should have some new consent features coming out soon, which will be really cool. Short of that, though, you can always manage that consent at the level of just firing Listen Layer or not. And then when those new consent features come out, you can do some really cool advanced stuff inside of Listen Layer. This is one of the most exciting features inside of the user source listener, is the ability to persist the information within the browser. We hope that you dig in, you start using it, and share back with us some of the cool things that you're doing so that the community can learn how to use Listen Layer.